I never enjoyed grammar in school. It felt like trying to do math with words, and I never knew why you'd want to do math with words anyways. So this always puzzled me until I finally figured out grammar is inflection and tone of voice in speech. If the words we write out are the words we would say, grammar adds all the things that we convey through the rising and falling of our voice, through the pauses that we make, through all of these things that make oral speech make sense. So for instance, grammar is the reason we know "That's my dog?" ends with a question mark, or "That's my dog" ends with a period or an exclamation point. What we conveyed through tone of voice, grammar makes visible on the page through the end punctuation. That's all it is, which means finding major errors in grammar is not about memorizing a bunch of rules. It's actually about speaking papers out loud. If you can hear where you pause, where you take a breath, where an idea stops as you're reading it out loud, especially if you're reading it to someone else, you can usually figure out most of the important parts of grammar. So, I highly recommend taking a minute to read this short paper out loud to somebody, especially someone who owes you a favor. Say, hey, you owe me a solid. Sit here, listen to me read this, and help me figure some of these things out. So that is the majority of what we're going to be going over. And the other thing we're going to be looking at is the way that a written paper for an academic or a professional setting is different from texting, because that is the other major place that we get errors, is that the way we would text this is not the way we should write it in a professional setting, though it is appropriate in texting. So knowing how to switch back and forth between these two different modalities is a really important part of professionalizing your writing. So first of all, capitalization. With texting, we rarely, if ever, capitalize. But unless we have autocorrect, and then it capitalizes way more than it should and probably gets some words wrong. But in an academic paper, you need to use capitalization appropriately. So if you're using a word processor like Word, which I highly recommend, it'll underline in blue whenever you forget to capitalize something. Pay attention to those. Those are good reminders. Excuse me. Now, subject-verb agreement. Subjects and verbs are the building blocks of a sentence. A sentence is composed of a complete subject and a complete predicate, which means a verb and all the stuff that goes with the verb. So, first you got to get the subject and verb in agreement in number and in number. So, is it singular? Is it plural? And then the case, first, second, third. I jump. He, she, it jumps. The dog jumps. We jump. They jump. Dogs jump. So it's where do you add the S? You add the S for the third person singular. That's how you make the subject and verb agree. Now, how do you make sure that you have a subject and verb in every sentence? Complete subjects here are in bold. And then what follows is the complete predicate in each sentence. So let's look at this one down here. While we were out walking, we. What is the subject here? We is the subject, which occurs twice. And so the complete subject is both this clause at the beginning and then this final we. And what did we do? What is the action, the verb here? Saw. Now there's another verb here. Running, right? The dog is running. But what we are doing is seeing something. So we saw is the subject verb, and this saw a small white dog running down the street is the complete predicate that is attached to that verb saw. It's what you saw. So that is how complete subject, complete predicate works. Now, how do we find these fragments? First of all, you could ask just, is there a predicate verb? Is there a subject? Does the group of words make a complete thought? That last one is usually the easiest. is there a complete thought here? And listening to when you pause, if you were reading this out loud, often lets you know where that is. So, here are kinds of fragments you can get into. A group of words with a subject and no verb, like uncontrollable horses. That's a thing, but we don't know what they're doing, so not a complete sentence. Or a group of verbs with a verb and no subject. And rode into the sunset. Who rode into the sunset? Who is the subject that is missing here? An ing word grouping by itself, riding along. Who is riding along? Again, there's no subject here. And no predicate verb, not we riding along, we were riding along, we are riding along. Are, were, the to be verb is the verb that's needed. And then a dependent clause standing alone, because the horses stopped. This is the one I see most often, or the appositive standing alone, which means riding in French. In texting, we would often send that as a single text to have emphasis, to have clarity, because it's a small group of words and we text and send so rapidly. But this is not a complete sentence. It does not have a complete subject. It does not have a complete predicate. We stopped for the night because the horses stopped. That would have been a complete sentence. Adding, okay, which means writing in French needs to have a former part where you're discussing this term used in this barn, which means writing in French, is now part of the English language. So, here is how you would revise a missing predicate or a missing subject. Think about these things, test yourself with the pretest, and then you're going to have the test afterwards. What is the reason for doing this now that we have things like Grammarly? Well, Grammarly is not always right. So knowing when to accept a change and when to reject it is really important. But what is way more significant than that is on a paper, you have time to submit it through Grammarly or to take it to a writing tutor and get it reviewed. But in your professional life, in your academic life, most of your writing doesn't have that kind of spare time. You might be sending off hundreds of emails a day in a professional setting, and you cannot run all of those through Grammarly. So what do? That's where all of this, making this second nature, remembering to read through it out loud before you send it to check for these kinds of errors is going to count. Because standard English is what we use in professional communications. It's not what we use when we communicate with our friends or in other settings, but in professional settings, you typically need to use standard English. So, learning all of these things for that future is what this practice is about.